Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jenny Clark. I am the founder and CEO of Love Your School. We are so excited that you're joining us today. We have done many webinars with our friends over at the Goldwater Institute. And today, Matt Beienburg with the Goldwater Institute is going to be walking us through an excellent presentation around Arizona's Empowerment Scholarship Account Program, specifically busting many of the myths that you may have heard about Arizona's ESA program with the actual facts. And I've seen this presentation. It is absolutely phenomenal. And so we're really grateful to Matt for his presentation today. A few quick little housekeeping things. We are having the chat open. Lucy and I are going to be monitoring the chat during the duration of this presentation. So put your questions in there. And then the ones that we maybe can't answer or need Matt to answer, we're going to answer those at the end of the webinar. So that's pretty much all. And if you can keep your cameras off and your microphones off for those of you that are attending, that would be perfect. And it's my pleasure, Matt, to introduce you. And we'll stop our sharing so that you can put your presentation up.
All right, thank you, Jenny and Lucy and everybody. I'll try to get this on here and get this to work for us. All right, is that coming through okay? All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Matt Beienburg. I'm the Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute. We're excited to chat with you. Going to run through a fair bit of content. So I'll talk a little bit quickly, but try to cover a lot of different topics. I know folks are coming at this with varying levels of background on the ESA program. But I think as people have learned about, I really want to hit some of these issues that get a lot of media attention and a lot of conversation. Sometimes it's heavy on commentary and light on fact. So I'm going to try to provide folks some information about this. So obviously Arizona's Empowerment Scholarship Account Program, as we are very fortunate to have first in the country to be open to all kids in the state of Arizona. So all K-12 students are eligible for this. It was expanded under Governor Ducey back in 2022 and gives about $7,500 per student of funding for families to choose anything from private school tuition, tutoring, special education therapy, at-home curriculum, a wide variety of uses. So there are, as many of you track this and can see, just crossed well over the 90,000, about 97,000 students who are currently being served by this program as of November of this year. Just want to share two testimonials. I think, we've got, again, 97,000 students being served, so there's a lot, but just to give folks a snapshot, I just like to share a couple of these that we've seen. Obviously parents have testified at the legislature, they've testified at the State Board of Education. I think these kind of sum up a lot of what we see. This is one who said, I'm a parent of 3 children on ESA, but I also have a master's degree in elementary education, and ESA has saved the educational lives of my 3 children. We tried public, private, charter schools. My child was able to meet some of her IEP goals in 4 months that no school had helped her achieve in 4 years. This is not, we've heard some derisive comments made about parents. What degrees do they have? What are their qualifications? This is somebody who has all the credentialing that's there, has tried all the different options, didn't find success for their child in the system. Another one here. In my community, school district students have an average math proficiency score of 8%. In reading, it's 14%. I'm thrilled my daughter has chosen to homeschool her 5 children, all of whom were adopted out of the foster care system. They go on to say, spent 4 years in the public school where she did not learn to read, was promoted year after year. After 2 years of homeschooling, she can now read at a 2nd grade level, and I'm so proud of her work. So I think that, again, kind of lays the table of this is the good that we are seeing from this program. But obviously, we have heard almost nothing but negative coverage of this program in the media. And so I want to kind of run through some of these, everything from ESAs are defunding our schools, they're bankrupting our state, they're emptying campuses and causing closures. They just help the rich kids go to expensive private schools. ESAs and private schools discriminate and don't serve disadvantaged students, and ESAs are just unaccountable and full of fraud. I think that's a litany of complaints and grievances that we've heard thrown around about the program. And so I want to address these, again, trying to go through these one by one. So in terms of the funding, I think we usually hear in education debates, our schools are underfunded, we need more funding, they've cut funding. That's usually the narrative. So this is actually a chart going back, this is Arizona specific, going back to the 1980s. And what you see here is a steady increase in funding. This is adjusted for inflation. If you look at that dark green bar, this shows you the total funding per student for Arizona public school students over the last several decades. And what you see is about a 50% increase in inflation adjusted funding per student today versus back in the 1980s. Now, you do see at the tail end there, this is through 2026, you do see a slight dip. And that, as many of you will recall, when the federal government pumped $200 billion, when the teachers' unions essentially shook down American taxpayers for the COVID era, all of that federal funding is now gradually sort of expiring. And so you do see that ticking down a little bit with that. So the question is, well, what about sort of state and local resources going to education? This chart shows here, as you see on the top there, total state and local funding for Arizona public schools has increased over $2.5 billion since the universal expansion in 2022. So looking at this chart here, you kind of see that dotted line cutting it in the middle. That's sort of before and after when the universal ESA program was expanded to serve all students. And you see that going, this is again, state and local funding alone. So you're taking out that kind of distortion from that infusion of federal dollars, going from 11.8 billion to 14.4 billion. So there is more money in the system, substantially more money in the system today than there was prior to the universal ESA expansion. And again, you can kind of see the difference here between public school funding and ESA funding. Obviously, ESA funding has grown substantially. The number of students who are in that program has increased substantially, and yet you still see the total funding going to that program relative to the total amount going to Arizona public schools from state and local taxes alone. On a per student basis and adjusted for inflation, and try to look at this from all different angles. If you, as you see there at the top, funding for these students has increased more than $500 per student adjusted for inflation compared to where it was before the universal ESA expansion, meaning Arizona public schools have more money per kid today than they did before the universal expansion happened. And the opponents of the ESA program, say, hey, look, it's taking funding away. What they don't tend to acknowledge is that Arizona lawmakers have actually taken a both and approach. When the universal expansion was passed, they poured over $600 million in that year alone of discretionary optional increases. This was not required by the funding formula. $600 million of extra funding for the public schools on top of those average statutorily formulaic requirements for the program, which is why you have a situation where our public schools today are getting more funding in total and per student adjusted for inflation from Arizona taxpayers. So the argument that we have, decimated funding for our public schools, we've defunded them, it just simply does not hold up to the data. All right. That was one of the talking points that we had heard for a long time. I think as opponents kind of recognize that funding for our schools has continued to be higher than it was, then they sort of shifted and they said, well, the ESA program it's not just defunding schools, it's bankrupting the entire state. That became a popular narrative for a while from the left. We published a long form piece on this. Folks can look into this, but just a few excerpts from this. In 2022, 2023, this was the first year with the universal expansion where was that surge of tens of thousands of kids who joined the program. Even after accounting for those students, Arizona posted a $2 billion budget surplus. So that was the year that all these students who were already in private or homeschool, the bulk of those kids already entered that program. Even accounting for that, the state of Arizona was running a $2 billion budget surplus. Now, the following year, the program did continue to grow substantially. And as it mentions here, the ESA awards actually exceeded projections for that year. It increased to over 75,000 students. But what the opponents don't like to mention is when you have more kids going into the ESA program and fewer kids going into the public school system, well, that has an offsetting impact. And so, as this mentions here, Arizona did experience an overall state budget deficit in 23-24. This was in spite of, not because of, the net savings generated by the ESA program in that year. So again, to be totally transparent, the budget analysts that year, when they were putting together the budget, the ESA costs actually came in $90 million higher than was budgeted for that year. And the public school costs came in $90 million lower. So on net, basically, the state is not any better or worse off from a funding perspective. So yes, if you have additional kids choosing an ESA, the total dollar amount of ESA awards is higher. And if instead of choosing a public charter school or a district, right, the state is no longer paying for those students in that. So the state is from a budget perspective, ambivalent between whether a student is being funded through one formula or the other in terms of the general fund impact when they're calculating this. ESA awards cost more because there's more kids, and the public schools cost less if there's fewer, right? Those have an offsetting impact. What is of note is that budget deficit came only after the state's governor, Katie Hobbs, vetoed an original budget that was sent to her by the legislature that would have left $1 billion in reserves in addition to the rainy day fund. Instead, the governor signed the ultimate budget that the governor eventually signed, increased spending by $2 billion to the highest level the state has ever had. And so there was not a cushion when revenues came in lower. All right, are ESAs emptying public schools and causing school closures? This is, again, now something we hear a lot about, complaints that, well, it's just destroying local neighborhood institutions and shutting down facilities. Obviously, this is something that gets people's attention, right? This isn't an abstract comment about funding or dollars or ideology. This is saying, hey, this neighborhood school near you, it's closing and it's ESA's fault, right? That's a very powerful message. And so we want to turn to this and take a look at this. Some of you may have seen this story. This was a headline from the Washington Post. So this was national coverage this summer. The headline read, "Public schools are closing as Arizona's school voucher program soars." That's a pretty clear message, right? That in Arizona, we've got this Wild West and our public schools are struggling because we've got this out of control ESA program. That's the takeaway from this. And they spotlighted the Roosevelt Elementary School District here in Arizona. For those of you who aren't familiar, Roosevelt's in the kind of South Central Phoenix area. It's an extremely disadvantaged, low-income community, and it has had perennial, for years, difficulties in academics, administration, all sorts of issues. And so the Washington Post said, look at this district. They've got a proposal. They're going to shut down 5 schools. And the sort of implicit message here is, well, schools are closing because the ESA program is raiding kids from our public schools, right? And again, that's a very powerful message for opponents of the program. What's interesting is when you actually look at this perfect case study, right? Again, national coverage on this issue, trying to demonize Arizona's ESA program. There were more than 10 times as many families in the Roosevelt district that opted out of that district for a different public school compared to the number of families utilizing an ESA. And so in actual concrete numbers, there were more than 8,000 students. Over half of the students who live within the Roosevelt Elementary School District in Arizona, they live within that district, so they would typically go to that school district. Over half of them, over 8,000, are going to a different public school, whether that's a different public charter school or a different school district. Every single one of those kids who does that takes their funding with them. And so if you have emptied out over half a district to other public schools, these aren't families who are opposed to public schools. They're not trying to go to private or home education, right? These are families who are saying, we actually want or are inclined toward the public school system, and they are fleeing that district and taking their funding with them. And as you see here on the screen, that compares to just 800 kids who live within that district who are on the ESA program, right? So 10 times as many families in this district, spotlighted for national coverage, have said no to that school district for a public school elsewhere compared to the number who have said yes to an ESA. And interestingly, if you actually look at the number of kids who switched out of that district to go to an ESA who were previously attending it, just 124, meaning you actually had hundreds of kids who had already said, this district doesn't meet my needs. I'm going to try and do homeschool or private school or whatever. But when the district is saying, look at this school is emptying out our kids, only 120 of them actually left who had not already left for one of these others. So again, yes, students have left that district for an ESA. Yes, that causes additional budgetary impacts. But for someone to try to write a story about this sliver of the students who are leaving, again, it's extremely disingenuous. And this is the narrative that we see from opponents and from the media who try to paint this picture of saying ESAs are what are destabilizing our school districts, rather than acknowledging that parents are fleeing and going elsewhere. And what's of note, if somebody wants to take the position and say, I don't think families should be able to take their kid and go to one of these districts or one of these charter schools or ESAs, you should be stuck in that district. That's at least an intellectually consistent argument. I think it's a terrible argument to say that you should have to go to school in whatever neighborhood you can afford to live. But unless people are opposed to those kids being able to go to a public school elsewhere, they have no actual financial argument for why the ESA program is any worse, right? If a kid says, I'm leaving Roosevelt to go to an ESA, funding goes with them, just like if the kid leaves Roosevelt and goes to another school district or a charter school. This I like folks to be aware of, right? So there's this question of what is this impact on schools? Are we destroying these institutions that have been there for a long time? This ESA program is just hollowing these things out. This is a report from the State Auditor General. This is from a few years ago, and I think this quote is very telling. They wrote, between fiscal years 2004 and 2017, Arizona school districts added 22.6 million square feet of building space, a 19% increase, despite student enrollment increase of only 6% during the same period. As they summarize, school districts built additional schools when they already had low capacity usage rates at their existing schools. In short, districts ran around in the 2000s building massive amounts of additional school space, even when their existing facilities were not at capacity. right? And so we hear a lot about fixed costs. What are the schools going to do? They can't adjust. We don't hear any concerns when it's the other way, when schools are building extra space that they don't need, rather than putting those funds into instruction for the students. I also want to highlight this. This isn't one that, again, I think people are sort of broadly aware of, but in this kind of media effort to demonize the ESA program, this also gets overlooked. In Arizona, this is from ABC 15, Arizona birth rates fall 36%. So we've had a significant decrease in the birth rate, both nationally and in Arizona. So as they're mentioning here, right, 36%, that's a very substantial decrease. This chart here shows you actual births in Arizona going back to 1998 up through 2020. And what you see in those dark blue bars are the number of births, and then above that, in those kind of hollowed out portion, is essentially the foregone births, right? Those are all the kids who, if we had even not increasing, right, just keep it flat, not even from the peak, but if you just keep that flat from where we were back in 2007, these are all the kids who essentially are not in that system, right? Because we have this drop in birth rates. We have fewer students being born. And if you look at what that means, right, you can see that those who were born in 2019 are essentially today's first graders. So if you've got 15 or 20,000 kids fewer born in that year, that's working its way through the system, right? You have 15,000 fewer kids in that grade who simply aren't there on account of the birth rate going down. So when you take all of that together, you have a substantial decrease in the number of students that are just in the system overall, right? Again, this isn't to even make a comment on the pros or the cons of it yet. It's just to understand this is a major phenomenon that is happening. So as we put all these things in perspective, again, it is true, the ESAs, if students are choosing an ESA, that's one fewer student who's going to the public school, right? It's perfectly fine to have that conversation, but what opponents don't like to do is to look at this and say, okay, if we're actually talking about what are the pressures on our public school system and where are kids going, let's be honest, let's look at the whole picture. So this chart does that. This shows you have over 800,000 students in our Arizona school districts today. If you compare that, you have over 300,000 students who are not attending their public school. They are attending a different public school. So in terms of enrollment pressures on our public schools, competition amongst the public schools themselves has a massive impact on students who are saying no to, again, a district like Roosevelt and going elsewhere. Those students are going to public charter schools, they're going to other districts, but you see hundreds of thousands of kids are saying no to their local districts and going elsewhere. Every time one of those kids does that, their funding goes with them, right? So to the extent we're making this argument that we're defunding our schools, that has a significant impact on where those dollars go. Next to it, again, I showed you that birth rate chart. If you add those up, you're talking, and this is a conservative. This isn't even assuming what would have been if there were just normal growth in that population. This is looking just the decline. 180,000 fewer students in that system as a result of that decline in birth rate. It's not until you get to the very far right of this chart for the ESA program, you see about 96,000 kids total, about 40,000 of whom switching. That's the sliver that they are complaining about to say this is emptying out our public schools. And so if they want to say that sliver over on the far right is destroying the column on the far left while skipping over everything else that's there and saying ESAs are really the cause of our problem and ignoring the fact that they have built up schools, built up facilities, expanded them, even as the enrollment wasn't there to support it, and even as there's competition amongst the public schools themselves, this shows just how, again, disingenuous this is. They find that kernel of truth, right? Yes, there is an enrollment pressure from all of these, but to zero in on the ESA program is simply disingenuous. Now, interestingly, I like to share this. That birth rate, when you dig into that a little bit, there's actually a few pieces that come out. This is just from this year, from the Financial Times. This is showing across the world and specifically in the US, birth rates are falling more steeply among progressives. And so if you look at this, over on the left, that chart on the left, starting in about the 2000s or 2010s, you see the birth rate amongst conservatives actually holding fairly steady, a very slight decrease, and yet a very significant drop amongst those who identify as progressive. And so you see that similarly here. This is also one that came out from scholars at the University of Virginia recently, showing essentially the same result. Drop in number of children amongst those who identify more left of center. And so why is this relevant? What does this mean? Why is this happening? We've seen headlines such as this, right? This is from the AP. Anxiety over global warming is leading some young Americans to say they don't want children. From the University of Arizona, this is one of the faculty members associated with the Honors College at U of A. children are expensive not just for parents, but the environment. So how many is too many? Which he goes on to basically say that having more than two biological children is a morally questionable decision. And so if you have a system where essentially you have massive amounts of families who are being told, don't have kids, it's the wrong thing to do, well, that leads to that decrease in number of students. So essentially you have the same opponents of the program saying, how dare you send your kid to, either you're doing home education or a private school, how dare you do that? While at the same time saying it's wrong to even essentially have kids in the first place or to have too many. And so, ironically, those who are saying, hey, I want to educate my student in maybe it's a religious school or an at-home environment, they're being demonized by saying, how dare you not send your kid to prop up our public school institution with students by the very same people in many cases who themselves are not having kids to fill those institutions. Now, I want to focus on this one. We've written about this several times. We hear chronically about the ESA program is welfare for the rich. It's welfare for the wealthy. It just funds rich kids to go to expensive private schools. This is a chart based on US Census data, and we've got a full report on this. Folks can check this out. And what this chart essentially shows you is what is the income distribution of kids in Arizona's public schools, private schools, and homeschools. And you don't need to look at all the numbers here, but essentially what this shows is you have kids in all three, all across the income spectrum, right? You have very low income students in public, private, and homeschool, and very wealthy students. It is true, students in private school tend to skew wealthier than those who are in public school, but what you see is kids across the income spectrum in all of these. And interestingly, particularly the homeschool population, you actually have it skews the other way, right? A high percentage of those who are lower income who are, this is a very popular option for ESA families, and sort of by definition, right? If you only have one earner, right? If one of them is a stay-at-home parent who is taking that time to educate their students rather than asking taxpayers to fund their kids' education in the public school system, it's no surprise that a lot of those families actually tend to skew lower on the income spectrum. And so what does this chart mean in terms of its impacts for the state and for the ESA program? So it turns out that Arizona taxpayers spend $1 to $2 billion a year on Arizona public school students whose families make over $150,000. It's not to say that's good or bad, but that is 10 times more than is spent on similarly wealthy students in the ESA program who joined under this universal expansion, who were in those private or home schools already. So again, we hear from the left, why are we giving funding to these families who don't need it? These are rich families. They make too much money. It's welfare for the wealthy. And yet we hear not a peep about that same logic when it comes to a wealthy family walking in the public school. And so you can think of, right, a family who has a kindergarten student, and if, it could be Bill Gates' student, right? If Bill Gates is here and the Gates family, wants to have someone walk through the public school system, taxpayers pick up the tab 100% for that kid in the public school system, no matter how wealthy the parents are. And that's what we see here, that $1 to $2 billion. So from the state's perspective, there is no rational reason to say, yep, we're happy to pay for that kid when you walk into a public school, but not if you walk into the ESA program, other than simply opposition to the program, right? But there's no intellectually consistent argument to say we're going to try to means test ESAs or we're going to try to cap it at a certain level, but the public school population is everybody. Now, if somebody, again, wanted to say, we think that all education should be means tested, if critics of the ESA program came out and said we should means test everything, again, that would be intellectually consistent, but to try and argue that we're going to pick winners and losers and say, yeah, we don't care what your income is, you can go into the public school system, but not in the ESA program. Again, this isn't about actual dollars and financial accountability. This is simply a preference for protecting one institution over the other. And these aren't simply Goldwater numbers. This is actually from ABC 15. Garrett Archer did a piece on this recently. And he dived into the numbers and he found when you look at he said, when you average all this together, Arizona kids live in zip codes making about $82,000. ESA student households, meanwhile, average about $90,000. Definitely better off, but not really wealthy. So again, same thing is essentially you have a program which serves kids all across the spectrum. Critics will say, well, it serves too many who are a little bit wealthier. But again, you're looking at 82,000 versus 90,000. This is not a radically dramatic difference. This is saying these are both, whether it's public schools or the ESA, serving Arizonans all across the income spectrum. The concern is not what is this family's income? It's are we providing options for families to excel, whether it's in a public charter school, a public district school, or an ESA. And alongside that, we've also shown this. Again, you've got this notion of, well, what good is an ESA to a family? What good does it do you to give them $7,000 if it's going to cost them $20,000 or $30,000 to go to private school, right? Only the wealthiest could afford that. Well, it actually turns out even that talking point is false. This is a chart that basically shows the distribution of private schools in Arizona and their tuition rates. And so it kind of shows how many schools in each range of tuition do we actually have. And you do have private schools in Arizona. You see on the far right there with tuition rates exceeding $15,000 a year. But where do you see that huge clump of schools? It's actually in that $6,000 to $8,000 range, right? If you go to your neighborhood Catholic school, for instance, those tuition rates are about $7,000 to go to that, meaning you can be a wealthy family or you can be a family of very modest means, and the ESA program literally will cover, if not 100%, nearly 100% of tuition there. So this program opens up private school choice to families regardless of their economic ability. All right, academic accountability. This is one we've heard a lot about. But I'd like to focus this on what we're talking about. And again, I think folks are somewhat familiar with this. This is from the US Department of Education. Average reading and mathematics achievement for 17-year-olds did not change significantly between the early 1970s and 2012, or between 2008 and 2012. This is nationally looking across the country at our public schools that for 50 years, we have not seen an increase. And across all demographics, as late as the 90s, essentially flat, right? White, Hispanic, Black, you don't see increases. We have been flat. Even as we saw that chart earlier, spending has increased both in Arizona and nationally, right? So our funding for our public schools has gone up consistently over time. Our outcomes have flatlined. This is for Arizona specifically over the last several years. Looking at, that's a similar picture in math and reading, and you see the percentage of students who are deemed proficient passing the state tests, about 30 to 40%, right? So the vast majority of our kids are deemed below. They are not proficient where they need to be in our public school system, right? So this is the world as it exists today in our public schools. And yet, even as 60 or 70% of kids are not actually proficient, this shows you how our public schools themselves are being rated. So these are essentially the report cards for our public schools. And what you see here in blue are the K-8 schools, in orange are the high schools. What share of schools are getting an A rating, a B rating, C, D, or F? And what you see here is enormous grade inflation, right? The vast majority of our public schools, it's over 90% at the high school, over 90% of those high schools are rated A or B, meaning families are told, if you go to this local public school, this is a solidly, it's a state-operated institution or a state contract institution. It's got our stamp of approval. It's got an A or B rated school. And yet we know that the vast majority of kids are struggling in these areas, right? So the fact that you can kind of see on the tail there, about 1% or fewer of these schools being rated F. So if you have 95% of K-8 schools being rated satisfactory, and you have just a very small fraction being rated unsatisfactory, you compare that on the one hand with the actual proficiency scores of those kids. I have yet to hear anyone explain to me how that provides accountability to families. What that does is give them a false sense of security, where we have created a system where we have tested them, we have labeled how the students are doing, and then we still simply give these schools a grade that says we're essentially passing everybody. This is from the Arizona Board of Regents. Similarly, this is looking at it, regardless, people have different views on testing. This looks at it from a different angle. They actually they do a report card of Arizona's public high schools and how those kids do afterwards. So they look at that and say, how do you do, setting aside, grades, you can, grade inflation, you can have all that stuff, but how do you do when it actually comes to outcomes after high school? And so this shows in Arizona, those little pie charts on the top, about an 80% graduation rate in Arizona. And then the number of kids who actually then go on to enroll and complete college, you see that dropping down to 24%. So whether or not someone goes to college or not, right, there's lots of different avenues. But if a student who graduates from our public school system goes to college, we have fewer than half of those kids actually then prepared to make it through that system, graduating on time or even within 6 years. So essentially, again, this is another angle showing that as our public schools are pushing kids through the system, right, they're graduating these kids. And even those who then say, hey, I think I'm ready for college, turns out they're not. And you can kind of see here, this is just a snapshot of some of the schools from the Scottsdale area, for instance. You see Coronado High School, 86% graduation rate, 42% college enrollment rate, and just an 8% college completion rate. So again, this is an example where we see if you're churning out and saying 90% of our kids have met our standards, they are graduated, we're ready to do that. And even those we're sending off to college, the vast majority of them are unprepared. Something is wrong, right? And to simply still pass those on and say, nothing to see here, this is good enough, that is not accountability. All right. And so the question where we hear, but what about the ESA program? I typically ask people, why don't we get our house in order on the public school system rather than trying to import a system that is there? We are already seeing the worst of all worlds in the public school system, right? You have all of the complaints about testing, right? Again, there's obviously a litany of arguments on both sides, but you have all of the machinery for testing, and yet we still essentially are doing nothing other than giving families a false sense of security. So I want to talk about the guardrails. This is something that we have heard a lot about recently, particularly in the last year. Common sense guardrails for the ESA program. Some of you may be familiar with various so-called reporters who have been covering the school choice issues for quite some time. This is a post from one of the 12 News correspondents saying ESA home and private school parents use these dollars to buy things like diamond rings, Kenmore appliances, and even lingerie, iPhones, smart TVs, gift cards, etc. Right? So these very colorful examples. Now, again, this is a program with over 90,000 families on it. Like any program, you do have people who try to break the law. What is the takeaway from colorful examples like this? Well, it actually turns out every one of these flag purchases is already illegal under the Arizona ESA program. There are guardrails. These purchases are illegal. You have people who try to break the law, and people in any program, right, who, even if statute says you cannot do this, you have people who try to break the law. Doesn't mean the law is bad. It means you have people who are trying to break the law. So let's look at this. In Arizona, the statute for the ESA program is extremely explicit. You can use these funds for specific enumerated things. Tuition, curriculum and supplementary materials, goes on to say especially. It explicitly says, you see there on the bottom, does not include televisions, telephones, video game consoles. These are explicitly barred in state statute. You look further, this is the State Board of Education approved handbook, goes through and says the following categories are prohibited: clothing, gift cards, jewelry, large appliances, right? All those colorful examples, every one of those is already prohibited and not permitted by this program. So when we talk about accountability, what again, the opponents of this don't like to highlight, ESA families, and for those who are listening, know all too well, right, are required to document scrupulously their purchases, all purchases, what they bought, how much that cost. Every one of those things gets logged, and every one of those purchases is then subject to audit, right? There's not just a family says, yep, I got my account and I'll see you in a few years. They're documenting all of these purchases. They are then subject to enforcement audits, right, to go through there and look at these things. Now, we've heard, again, from some of these reporters trying to say, well, all these purchases are being approved that they're not supposed to be, while ignoring the fact, again, this is language from the State Board of Education approved handbook. I highlighted this here. It explicitly says, items are not deemed approved by the department until they are audited or the time frame to audit these orders has passed, right? So as we are hearing right now, right, if the Department of Education says, okay, a family has come and said, we're trying to get our ESA purchases reimbursed, we are going to process that, right? We're no longer going to have this huge backlog where a family waits 6 weeks or 6 months to get their funds used. We're going to process that. We're going to push it forward, but that purchase remains subject to audit. So if that's not an allowable purchase, that is subject to audit, enforcement, and collections. Interestingly, that raises the question. So what are the chances of an audit actually taking place, right? And this is a quote that might be of interest. So what are the odds of getting audited? Very low. Interestingly, this is not in reference to the ESA program. This is in reference to our federal tax returns. 0.2% of all individual income tax returns filed for 2020 faced an audit, according to the IRS. That's 1 in 500, right? So if you think about this, the ESA program, you can use your annual taxes as an example. When the IRS processes your tax return, they don't say, thank you for submitting it. We will send you your tax return in a few years after we've audited this. They send you that check, and if someone has tried to commit, be a tax cheat or whatever else, they are then subject to auditing. That's literally how the system works. And if the policy prescription is no, we don't think taxpayers should get their tax returns until the IRS has looked at every single one of those, we're going to jam up that system. That's literally the same logic that opponents of the ESA program are trying to make. Now, interestingly, I like to just, again, highlight some of the background here. Despite, again, that scrupulous transparency from ESA families, documenting every single purchase, right? Every one of those things. We had a state lawmaker recently, this is from September, blocked a state lawmaker in Arizona who was requesting purchase level data, transaction level data of a school district, and was told those couldn't be provided to a state lawmaker even unless a $26,000 bill was paid for the cost of obtaining that data. We've seen reporting here, again, the Department of Education announcing that their efforts to perform collections, as you see here, money's being repaid, money's being subjected to collections, right? Those purchases you do have, whether through mistakes or bad actors, purchases that are not allowed under the ESA program, those are then subject to audit. I don't have any information on this in this slide, but we've actually written about in the past. We had seen under the previous superintendent administration, the Auditor General came out and actually did a study and found it was about a quarter of parents' questions when they went to the helpline and asked, can I buy this? Can I buy that? They were getting incorrect information, right? So you have a lot of families who are just literally trying to navigate this program and struggling to do it. It's a new program, not even to point fingers at administrators or parents in this case, but to say families are trying to navigate this. And so, yes, you're going to have instances where they're purchasing something that they might think is allowed. It's not. You go through that process, right? I also want to, so we have this question, don't we still need better enforcement? This is still one of those arguments that's made. So let's look at what are the actual proposals for enforcement and for supposedly common sense guardrails of this program. Now, interestingly, before I get to that, Governor Hobbs vetoed, and regardless of how you feel about any of these issues, Governor Hobbs vetoed that a proposal from the House that was sent to her desk to add $2 million for additional staff to review ESA purchases, right? So if the argument is, well, not enough of these are being looked at, there aren't enough guardrails, we need more people. Well, this was vetoed, right? Regardless of whether you feel that this is the solution or not, there was an effort put forward to say, if you're actually concerned about this, here is funding. That was vetoed. And so what ESA opponents, again, I like to share this, when ESA opponents are talking about guardrails, they mean something completely different from what the public does. And again, from the self-described journalists who in many cases, I think, want to pass off a notion of impartiality, we actually see some of these folks kind of giving the game away. This is from, again, one of the colleagues from 12 News who says there should be guardrails based on income. Going on to say the ESA program was never intended for wealthy Arizonans. It puts no stipulations in for income. You notice the word guardrails is used here to say, I want a policy change to cap the enrollment on this program. That has nothing to do with guardrails, right? That is simply taking one word that sounds nice and slapping it on a policy position. Setting aside, the comment, the ESA program was never intended for wealthy Arizonans. The ESA program was created by state lawmakers and expanded by state lawmakers to serve all Arizonans. This reporter may have a preference that only certain students or that no students be allowed to be on it, but this claim that we are seeking guardrails, this actually shows by guardrails what they want is to cut the program, to curtail those who can join it, and to eliminate it or scale it back. That's not guardrails. That's not enforcement of the law. That's trying to whittle away a program and the availability of that program for families. We've actually seen when you have opponents of the program get their way when it comes to so-called accountability and guardrails. This is an example I think folks are familiar with. The Attorney General came out last year with a plan to improve supposed accountability, in which not only, as they currently have to, do families have to document all their purchases and the dollar amounts. Again, that's how the process is. The Attorney General came out and said, also, those families have to justify why they are purchasing this item. They cannot do so unless they can show what this connection to a specific curriculum is. And so we actually see here that these two parents who we're representing at the Goldwater Institute trying to purchase things like kids' books. Brown Bear, what do you see, right? Flashcards, these are basic types of items that now a family is being told you can only buy those if you can justify it. And I can't make this up if I tried. This is not a caricature of it. This is literally a letter from the Attorney General's office where they are saying that if a family wants to buy something, they have to explain it. And the example they give here, this is in a letter. If a family is buying something like pencils, they expect them to write, quote, these pencils support my student's second grade math curriculum because they will allow him to practice writing out fractions. In no universe does that improve any outcome for parents, for administrators, for students. This is needless, mindless bureaucracy shoved on parents in the name of accountability. All this does is create a mound of paperwork for parents to have to deal with and for administrators to have to look at. The State Board of Education had said, obviously, educational purchases like pencils do not need to go through any kind of explanation or discussion of what this is. They're pencils, they're kids' books. Obviously, these are educational. We're not going to ask parents to waste time. And yet the Attorney General's office thought it was a great policy idea, seemingly, to require this. Interestingly, for folks, again, as we're having these conversations about fraud and misspending in programs, others have talked about the kind of food stamp issue nationally. This is actually a live issue staring down Arizonans and the budget immediately. So Arizonans currently, as you see here, this is from the Arizona Joint Legislative Budget Committee. There's a current error rate of 8.8% in the Arizona food stamp program. As the GLBC states, this is the state budget office, we estimate that this will cost the state $185 million on an annual basis. So Arizona's food stamp rate, $200 million, that's a hit to the state budget due to the improper payment rates for the food stamp program. And yet we're not hearing the same kind of outrage and concern in these programs that are literally about to cost Arizonans massive amounts of funding because they're not in compliance with the actual error rates that the federal government has said are reasonable. So it is true, fraud, waste, and misspending is a big problem, as I point out here, in Arizona's public schools. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but I like folks to just be familiar with this and to understand. Dysart School, some of you may have seen this headline, defends 500,000 Vegas trip as students lose bus service. This is a Yuma Elementary School district flagged by the Auditor General, in which you had 9 felony counts related to misuse of public funds, fraudulent schemes, embezzlement schemes. You had a district staffer using the district's credit cards to buy gift cards in various amounts. And you go through this and you see them finding the district failed to adequately follow up on the purchases, never restricted this employee's credit card use. We highlighted this one. This is taxpayer-funded wine tastings, in which the Creighton Elementary School District sent school board members and staff to a DEI training in Napa, California, which involved a chairman's soiree, essentially wine tastings at a clip of $4,000 per person. You have the Auditor General flagging the district spending $150,000 on a raceway sponsorship, which it describes as wasteful, potential violation of the state's gift clause. They say the district wasted more than $18,500 on public monies for things including staff to attend golf tournaments. You have this school district in the south here, $340,000 for a 2-day conference, in which the Auditor General finds this district blowing past maximums on things like lodging and food, right? Which they describe as unnecessary, potentially wasteful. My colleague here at Goldwater recently issued a report on superintendent pay in Arizona, in which not only are the compensation packages for these employees, in many cases, fairly generous as a whole, they include things like $1,200 a month car allowances. They include things like double dipping into retirement programs. So not only are these superintendents given access to the state pension program, on top of this, the taxpayer-funded state pension program, not only are taxpayers footing the bill for that, they are funding a second time massive contributions to then private retirement accounts on top of that. So taxpayers are essentially getting double charged for the retirement packages of these superintendents. As you see here, in this case, $45,000 a year in contributions to that on top of the pension in this school district here. Folks may remember from a few years ago, the Buckeye superintendent getting in hot water for over $1 million in excess compensation. Fortunately, this one, my understanding, has been mothballed, but this again shows the, I would say, poor stewardship of many of those in our public school system, right? This was an attempt to get an $80 million domed stadium in the Tolleson School District here in Arizona. Despite all of the financial questions swirling around, $80 million for a domed stadium is something that, again, I think for folks who are trying to say we need to spend our taxpayer dollars wisely, certainly is something questionable. Again, glad to see that this is seemingly not moving forward, and yet to see so much support from superintendents who are pushing for that really, I think, is, again, emblematic of some of the problems that we've seen. We've seen ABC News, again, covering some of the issues who are trying to say, in terms of just transparency, right? Are public schools not posting superintendent pay packages or contracts on their websites, right? All of these conversations against the ESA program, all these arguments made against it, not transparent, not accountable. And yet then we see on the public school system all these instances of fraud, misspending, or lack of transparency. And obviously, folks, I think are familiar from just this last year, the Isaac School District, as the headlines here, plunged into chaos, $30 million, falsified financial records, right? Just enormous financial mismanagement and poor stewardship of resources here. So it's not to say that all districts are necessarily bad actors, but the disproportionate coverage that is given to the ESA program while turning a blind eye to our public school system in terms of the funding and the decisions that are made there, I think, again, is fairly telling when it comes to what folks are trying to do against the ESA program. So I'm going to stop there. Again, I appreciate everybody's time. I know that's a lot of information. I'm happy to, Jenny, if there are any questions that came through the chat to speak some more on that or respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. I was taking lots of screenshots myself, and also we were sharing different quotes from your slides and also some of the things that you shared in the chat. So parents, if you're here, you can feel free to copy and paste those or share those. It's really, really important that we use, our social media, our Facebook, our Instagram, our X accounts to get the truth out about Arizona's ESA program, especially as it relates to things that Matt addressed, like the accountability argument, funding, approved items. So it looks like over here in the chat, the only question that's popped up right now was related to the Dysart story. And I'm planning to send the link over on that. So I can add into that later. Denise, I think we are planning to share some of the slides. I know a lot of people were doing different screenshots throughout. I know that I'm going to do a tweet thread, Denise, about the slides that you can reshare too. Another question about the slides and the link. How can we access the stats at a later date? Camille, one thing that's really good for you to know is that all of Matt's reports and articles, both through the Goldwater Institute or on their website, and then other articles that he's written for like AZ Free Press and those places, we've put all of those things, including articles that he referenced from like Jason Bedrick at the Heritage Foundation, on our website, defendingeducationfreedom.com. So they're available there as well, and we can share that link too. So we have all of that information there. There's one thank you. This was a great truth bomb, a preschool mom just trying to learn everything. So there's one thank you there, Matt. Lucy has also shared the link to our website. We were having some issues with it yesterday, so hopefully it's back up. Our defending. Okay, Lucy says it's good. Sometimes those security server things go down. But we'll just hang on for a few more minutes for all of you listeners in case you have any other specific questions related to anything that Matt said, but nothing had come in during the presentation. Let's see. No, still no more questions in there. Matt, do you have 2 seconds to just go back and mention the Dysart story, since that was one question in there, and that will give me a second to pull up the link?
Sure. Yeah. Again, this is one of a litany of examples where you essentially had this, and we've unfortunately seen it's not even. I don't mean to dunk on a specific district here, which is why I tried to kind of share several, where you have these national conferences that essentially are put on, and school districts, public school districts, send large numbers of whether it's administrators or board members to these conferences. And, again, several of these things being featured in places like Las Vegas, at the same time, then that school district turned around and essentially reduced some of the bus routes and some of the transportation. And so to see this juxtaposition, right, to say, well, there's not the resources available for providing, again, regardless of the debate on the efficiency of the transportation system or anything else, if the district is saying, we don't have the funds to do this, and then turning around and sending a whole bunch of people to a training in Las Vegas, that's where you see, again, this just poor stewardship on behalf of these are, again, government officials of the resources that are entrusted to them. So without even needing to micromanage or nitpick every individual decision, this is just intended to show you have, again, these decisions that are being made. Some of them are well-intentioned. I shared that information about the Auditor General, right, saying our school districts are building massive amounts of new facilities even when they don't need to. What that eventually leads to, right, is this massive rerouting of funding. As the Auditor General had pointed out, this basically means thousands of dollars that could have gone to teacher pay in some of these districts because it's being sent elsewhere. And so examples like Dysart and this Vegas training is just one of a number of showing the decisions here that these districts are making are not being made with a kind of budget-minded financial scrupulousness that we would be expecting from those operating our school districts.
Great. Looks like we have another question in there about the lawsuit related to purchases having to have curriculum linked to that. I know that's been in process for a while.
Yeah, unfortunately, litigation moves slowly, so that is still going through. Again, when you look at the statute that is there, when you look at the argumentation, this idea that says that families should have to justify or rationalize why you're purchasing things. Again, the State Board of Education has repeatedly approved handbook language saying these things are very clear, right? There are items that are a little less conventional, that they'll say, well, if you can sort of explain what you're using this for, those sort of edge cases, we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about very cut and dry, obviously educational pencils, books, right? There's no way to spin this as anything other than this is something obviously for my kid. And yet now we're seeing efforts to say, no, we're going to throw up essentially needless roadblocks and difficulties here that really do nothing other than grind the program down. We obviously saw for a long time there was that huge backlog of ESA purchases. And so, if the opponents of the program want to go after it and say, look, they're letting purchases go through because they're not holding them, they're processing them. This is terrible. Or no, we're going to have this huge backlog, right? The opponents of this program really have gone, I would say, out of their way in many cases to simply try to advocate for policies that, again, are not about improving student outcomes. They're about scoring political points, just describing as guardrails, right? Saying we want to income cap this program. I think kind of gives the game away that these aren't serious calls for accountability or improvements for students. These are really a political attack on a program that they don't like.
Good. There was another good question higher up that I missed from Camille. Can you briefly explain again the disparity about school ratings versus actual student performance? And if you want to put a slide up, you can.
Sure. Yeah, students get they get their report cards in school, they take state tests, and then the schools get rated. So you got all these different sources of data, and essentially we have this huge disconnect where how students are doing is poor, right? We've got this, if 60 or 70% of kids are not at a level of proficiency for their grade level, right? So the majority of kids are not where they need to be. And yet we have 90-some% of our public schools being rated excellent, great, satisfactory. You have essentially a false sense of security where parents are being told, if you enroll your student in, again, I used Coronado High School as an example, right? You enroll it in one of these public schools, it may not have an F or a D rating, and yet it's not serving those kids. And part of this issue is when they give that A through F letter grade, they're trying to say, well, how are the kids doing? But also how, are they improving? Which is a fair, obviously, right? If you're a school that's serving a more disadvantaged population, you might say, well, is that school still helping those kids along, right? Did they grow? And that's part of it. What we see when these ratings get given out is you essentially have these cut scores get set by the state that really becomes a sort of politicized process where if you have too many, it's grade inflation, right? We see it in colleges, we see it in schools. Nobody wants to get in a big fight of saying your school is not good enough. And so it's kind of easier to just say, the school is good enough, even though the students aren't doing well. And we've seen this again at all levels. There was a report that actually came out recently showing that, the report cards that are getting sent home to students, even in these schools, the vast majority of parents, saying, hey, my kid's getting a B or an A, and yet their kid is not proficient, right? That whether it's the parent, the student, whatever it is, let's at least be honest, right? If we're going to send that home, say your student's not where they need to be, let's find a way to help get them to where they need to be instead of just passing them along and saying, Johnny's getting a B, we're going to move him on to the next grade, even though he's not proficient. And then that takes us back to those slides I shared in the beginning of families saying, yeah, my kid kept getting advanced every year, but they couldn't read. So I took them out and I put them in the ESA program and suddenly they were thriving.
Mm. There's a few more thank yous in the chat. Let's see. I hope I didn't miss any other questions. I don't think so. Okay. Well, perfect. Folks are hopping off. All right. Hey, Matt, thank you again so much for the work that you and Jenna do at the Goldwater Institute, not only to get universal ESA passed, but also to protect and defend the program. As an ESA parent myself, I can say thank you on behalf of so many other ESA parents. And for everyone who joined us, thank you so much for being here. Again, please feel free to share any of the information that we have shared with you on any of your social media channels. Goldwater Institute puts out phenomenal reports and research that we at Love Your School are proud to amplify. And we'll be sharing out some different snippets and screenshots from this presentation as well that you guys can reshare. Any final thoughts, Matt, from you on your end?
Thank you very much, Jenny, Lucy, and everybody for joining.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.